All right, everybody. Hello. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. This is David Parsons. I hope all is well in your world, wherever that world might be. Got a great conversation for you today. I've been wanting to talk to Derf Backderf for a long time, ever since I read his graphic novel, My Friend Dahmer, a couple years ago. I think I've mentioned this book on the show. But he's got a new book called Kent State, 4 Dead in Ohio, which we get into in this conversation. We do talk a little bit about My Friend Dahmer as well. I wanted to talk to Derf because I think he's doing some really compelling historical work in the graphic novel medium. Go get his stuff and take a look at it, because I think it's honestly some of the best takes on the 1970s, on Kent State, and on kind of the fabric of American culture at particular times and in particular regions. I really can't say enough about it, and so I was really, really happy to finally get a chance to ask him where all this stuff comes from and how he's connecting his own personal kind of experiences and memories with the sort of larger history of this era. So this is really fun. I hope you enjoy it. We've got lots more Nostalgia Trap stuff all over the place. I've been doing live streams. We did our first one with Danny Bessner last week, putting them up on YouTube on Thursdays at 1 p.m. Pacific time. We're live. So if you want to see us there, you can see us live. Otherwise, if you miss it, we'll be posting the audio for our patrons. So if you want to become a part of our Nostalgia Trap Club, you got to go to patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap. And now is a good time to join, because we've been putting up our LA 1990s movie series with Danny Bessner. We put up our post-election meltdown with Justin Rogers Cooper. And we've got our live show on the JFK assassination with Justin Rogers Cooper and Bill Black and other special guests. That's happening Tuesday, November 24th at 5 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. Eastern. You can check all of this stuff out at patreon.com/Nostalgia Trap and be a part of it and be in the Zoom room with us as we go down the rabbit hole of JFK. Would love to see some more Nostalgia Trappers there. We had a really fun time when we did our last live show. So we'll be doing another one next week. All right. Thanks to all the people who are supporting the show, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Derf Backderf. Derf Backderf. I guess I should just call you Derf. I love your work. Your work has been something I've been familiar with for a while. A friend of mine several years ago handed me a copy of My Friend Dahmer as a gift. And it sort of introduced me into the whole world of what you're creating, which I think is honestly, I think you're doing some of the best histories of the 1970s that are out there. And for those that listen to Nostalgia Trap, know that I'm sort of, we're sort of obsessed with the 70s as a really key critical moment in American history, and one that historians don't really spend much time thinking about. And you've got a very particular take. So anyway, thanks. That's just to say thanks for joining me, Derf. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. I just finished your book, Kent State, 4 Dead in Ohio. Honestly, I just said this to you before we started recording, but it's I've been thinking about Kent State for a long time, and what the events that transpired there, how it's depicted by historians, and I think honestly, I don't know if anyone will get it better than you in terms of what you've created with this book. So first off, congratulations. I know that's a high compliment, but we can get into sort of why I think that.
Sure.
But maybe I can start with a boring NPR style question. What made you want to write about Kent State at this point?
Write about Kent State?
Yeah.
Well, I grew up very near Kent State, as you know from reading the book. It was like 20 miles away. And when you're from that part of the country and had any connection to that era at all, and I was just a kid, but when you have those things, it's part of your DNA. I mean, we all know Kent State, and over the years, I still live in the area. I live in Cleveland now. And it amazes me how many people I run into just throughout, particularly in the arts circles, but also in media and everywhere else, who were connected to the shooting in some way. Either they were students there, or they were media covering the event, or they taught there. I mean, it really struck me. And I would get their stories over the years, and it's just something I've always carried around with me my whole life. You know, I mean, I've always followed the history with each revelation over the years, and read up a lot about it, and it just was part of me. So I always felt it would be a great story, and it just took me a while to get to, but it was always on a list of books that I wanted to get to.
Yeah, it's kind of a daunting story too. It feels like because it's one that like feels it's really heavy, and it's been told in different ways over the years. But I feel like I'm thinking now, are there cinematic depictions? Are there movies?
There is one TV movie from 1981, which was not all that great.
Wow.
So yeah, no, the opportunity was there. I mean, to tell it visually, and I felt that all right, I can bring something different to this. So that was my thinking.
Yeah, early on, and I noticed this in your notes that you used James Michener's early book about Kent State that sort of like has maps in it, and
I did a little. I
but
did. That's full of mistakes and kind of exaggerations. It's more a period piece than a piece of serious journalism. There's actually a better book early on called 13 Seconds, which was written by a couple of Cleveland Plain Dealer reporters who were covering the event. And in fact, there was an infamous shouting match between those two reporters and Michener on, I think it was on the Today Show in 1970, which I've never been able to find a recording of, as hard as I've searched. But Michener's book, it's got good information, but it's not the go-to source by any means.
The reason I bring it up is because I remember maps in it, and you certainly make use of sort of like the sort of like what the campus looked like, and how this actually took place, and I feel like you oriented us there. But I remember the Michener being also containing like a lot of letters to the editor from local newspapers that sort of like captured that town and gown phenomenon. I thought you right. I'll share some of this stuff when we post this episode, but I thought you like the town and gown phenomenon is something that I had to kind of figure out when I was researching the 60s and 70s, but you do it in one page, and I'm like sitting here being like, as a historian, like you do it in one page visually. You depict this couple like standing in front of their house, right. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about that in terms of Kent State, because it's something that I didn't know. One of the many things I learned from your book is that people like the guys that became Devo, or like Chrissy Hine from the Pretenders, like there was sort of like this cultural thing going on at Kent State.
Joe Walsh too, he was there.
Right, Joe Walsh. So like as a
all
young
these guys
kid,
were on campus during the shootings. Yeah, it's crazy. Some of them were in the line of fire.
That's unbelievable, and I'm wondering if Kent State sort of occupied a position in your head as a kid as like where the cool people were, like kind of like an entryway into rock and roll culture or something like that.
Yeah, a little bit. Because they had a couple good clubs in Kent that I used to go to before I went off to college, because I went to college at Ohio State. Mm-hmm. I didn't go to Kent State because of the bad taste left by the shootings. I just it was like nah.
And that,
so it was
wasn't that years later when you went to college?
Yeah, it was 10 years later. Yeah. I mean, it was early 80s. Yeah. Yeah. And the world had changed. But they had just had a huge protest on the Kent State campus because they built a gym over part of the shooting site and obliterated a lot of it. I mean, part of their plan to like obliterate all of it, which thankfully failed. But there were thousands that, were brawling with cops. They had to be hauled away, including the parents of some of the victims had to be hauled away. I mean, it was ugly. And all that was going on just as I was picking a college, and not surprisingly, I was like, I don't think so. Pass.
Yeah.
But it had some great clubs, and I used to go there. I was working it as a garbage man after high school. And I used to go there on the weekends and go to punk shows. Yeah. So it was a cool spot. I mean, it was a big campus, big college, and a lively college town. So all those things were attractive, but I passed.
Yeah. Part of what I think comes out of your book is, for me, a wider picture of what Kent State University was and why it was important and how it grew exponentially in the years leading up to. I think you have statistics in there that are kind of stunning in terms of how many people, how many students are there.
6,000, I think it was 6,000 in 1960, 21,000 by 1970. Yeah, it was staggering growth, and with that came all those problems. Because it was, and there are colleges like this all over. I mean, it's a liberal, very progressive college community within this bright red countryside all around. And it was a different type of partisanship back then. You had that huge generation gap factored into it, which we don't have anymore. It was kind of hard to penetrate because, that was not my experience either. So to place yourself back in that time, you really had to focus on that. And it was a unique time because of that. It was that kind of generational conflict. I mean, it was all out war.
It feels like it, and it comes out really vibrantly in these pages in terms of I love the way you recreate this sort of social milieu of kids hanging out. There's just sort of a warmth of hanging out on the floor or talking in clubs with SDS revolutionaries, and there's sort of like this pastiche. How it's a big question, but how do you reconstruct all of that stuff? Because, like you said, your generational position is really interesting to me because I think they call it, I don't know if you know this term, Generation Jones, the people.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
right. Like, how are you looking at the quote unquote 60s? Because you're really young when that's happening.
Yeah. Well, I was 10 years old in 1970. So I mean, it was not my generation. It was not my experience.
Right.
I never had to worry about the draft. I never had to worry about the war. So. But, you just talk to people. I mean, that was the key. I mean, I knew it was a period piece. I knew that I had to somehow penetrate that era and place myself in the middle of it. So I just talked to people who were there and, just try to take in as much as I could and their everyday lives in particular and what they were thinking and experiencing and what they hoped to achieve. And of course, didn't achieve in many cases, and it was a painstaking process.
How much of the story as you began? How much of the project was about sort of directly recovering the lives of the four that died? Because it seems
that was everything. Yeah, that was my big idea going into it. Because when you sit down with a book, you have to think, all right, what's my book about? And as you said, there's been a lot of books about Kent State, probably 20, 30 over the years, some good, some bad. But my idea was to tell the story entirely through the eyes of the four, the eyes and experiences of the four. So I'm literally putting the reader on the ground with these kids, and we walk through these 4 days in May 1970 with them, and we experience everything they did, and it humanizes the story in a very personal way because you get to know these kids, and then when they're cut down, it packs a wallop. So that was my idea going into it. So that's really what I focused on.
It does, and I don't know, you've probably thought a lot, maybe more than I have, about this sort of relationship between cinema and graphic novels and comics. But this sort of the way that you've told the story, when I get to the page particularly of Jeff Miller, whose death was captured, I think, or whose body became the sort of Pulitzer Prize winning photo, and God, that page killed me, man. And I honestly don't know. And I wonder what you think of this. I don't know if a movie can capture it in quite the same way as because of the force of what you've created with all the sort of information about what's happened. I really felt the context of it. Maybe I just react to the comic that way, but I'm looking forward to sharing this with my students because I think they'll be impacted by it as well. But I'm wondering what you think about that because I'm thinking about the movie of Kent State and I'm already cringing because so many historical movies are terrible.
Right. Well, yeah. Some aren't bad.
Yeah,
there's been a lot lately too. I mean,
that's true.
Trial of the Chicago 7 and Mrs. America, which was really great.
Mm-hmm.
Trial of Chicago 7 had its moments, I thought.
I haven't watched it yet. We're actually going to do an episode with John Wiener, who wrote the book, next week. So very much looking forward to how they portrayed.
Well, it's all connected to Kent State as well.
Right.
I mean, the Chicago 7 leads right into Kent State. So, but to get back to your question, if I remember your question,
sorry,
got distracted there. Film and comics.
Sorry, your work brings a lot out, Derf. Right. There's a lot going on in
it. They're similar because they're both visual storytelling mediums, but comics have their own unique strengths. And one of those is that you can really go in depth in a way that film you can't. I mean, you got to keep that. I don't know. It seems to just you can have very strong visuals, obviously, but it's not. It's a different kind of visual, and I can pause the, action, and you can sort of ponder it and just linger over it, which you can't really do in film because film just keeps going. So yeah, they're fellow travelers, but I think they're each unique, and I think comics are uniquely positioned to tell a story like this.
Yeah, I mean that moment with Miller laying there is right. A moment that again you had the photo already, and you sort of depicted it from a different angle. It's a really I was waiting for that moment in the in the book.
It's a tough one. That's a tough one because it's such an iconic photo.
Right.
You just don't want to recreate it.
Yeah.
Because that's always lame. It seems staged. It's stiff. And I remember that TV movie. They like paused, like all the actors froze in the exact position of the photo. For a second to make it. Okay, here's the photo. We're gonna hammer you over the head with it. Here's the photo. And it was totally lame. I mean, it's supposed to be this powerful moment, but it wasn't. So what I actually did was focus on the scream, the sound effect of the scream, which carries over 3 pages.
Yeah.
And because that's the one thing the photo doesn't have. We know she's screaming, we see she's screaming, but we don't have that sound effect as a visual, which is something unique to comics. So, I mean, you have to look at the book. I know it's stupid to describe it.
Go look at this book. Right. And like I said, I mean, I've used graphic novels in the last several years. I teach American history, so I've used graphic novels in my classes, and they've been very, very effective. I feel like students really respond to them. They get you into actual history and information in a way that a documentary or film or another just textbook doesn't quite do. It's a really effective medium for history. And it feels like this. I feel like every single one of your books is a history book, but it feels like this one is a leap into a different direct form of doing history. Were you aware of that? Did you feel like this was a sort of a leap into something different? Because your other books are much more personal. It seems like they're much connected to your own experience.
Right, exactly. That's a good observation. Yeah, I'm not part of this story, and I don't pretend to be. I have a brief peripheral connection to it at the beginning, but that's it. I mean, I wasn't there. It's not my generation. I have nothing to do with it directly. So yeah, that is a leap for me. Usually my other books are all based at least on my experience, even though they may not be autobio. But you like to try different things. And the thing that did it for me with all my books is that I look for a really great story. And this is a great story. Yeah. I mean, it has everything. Drama and outrage and it has everything, and I always felt it would be a great story and one that really hasn't been told in this way. So that was my thinking.
Yeah, a couple of friends that I talked to because I told them I was excited about this interview with you, and I told them about your book, and they asked, well, does it come down on a why? Why did they open fire at Kent State? Why did that happen? And I said, well, you're gonna have to read the book because it feels like part of what I think your book gives me a better and a more clear picture of why that happened than most other things I've read. But was that sort of a challenge to sort of think about, like, how am I going to answer this question? Because it feels like really you set up like there are many. It's a long story. There are many different unique things going on at Kent State. I mean, I'll just point out one because I thought it was an incredible fact at the beginning where you described that there were 5 different law enforcement agencies that were sort of had jurisdiction over the students at Kent State University, including like the FBI and military intelligence, local sheriffs. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable, that sort of stuff. I guess my question is, how much of that did you know beforehand? And was it sort of like your project here is sort of putting together all the major different pieces that sort of made this possible?
Well, paranoia is a big theme in the story, particularly from flowing down from Nixon and then filtering out into society. And we're seeing some of that today with Antifa and BLM.
For sure.
I mean, it's the exact parallel. So that paranoia reached such a fever pitch that it resulted in tragedy. I mean, though there's other moving parts. You know, there's an element of malevolence here. There's a huge element of incompetence. There's brazen politics. You know, kind of crashed political opportunism and all kinds of things. It's a complicated story. So yeah, but all of these threads, you know, at the climax of the book, come crashing together on that sunny hillside at Kent, and then suddenly people are dead. So that was the challenge to get that across, you know, and there are some things we don't know. So because there was a cover up and it worked, and these people are still have never spoken publicly. They've never admitted anything. No one's ever confessed. We don't know why they opened fire specifically. We suspect, but we don't know for sure. So yeah, it was tricky. I think I pulled it off. I spent a lot of time thinking about how I was going to portray that, and you know, the reader can decide for themselves, I guess.
Yeah, I think what comes out, and I think what I appreciate about the book, is that it feels like a work of real serious history, and that it's not, you know, coming down and saying it was this guy or this conspiracy or this one answer. No. Instead, we're shown that history is complicated, and what came together to make those fingers pull those triggers is something that comes from the moment, comes from the culture, comes from the region, comes from so many different things. There's one thing I definitely wanted to bring up, because it's a fact that I maybe read once and forgot, but it's kind of stunning. Of many of the stunning things in your book, Derf, is that is it Captain Snyder that plants a pistol on Jeff Miller. So that famous photo that everybody knows that photo of Jeff Miller's body, and it's a girl screaming over his body. But that student had a gun planted on him by law enforcement or military.
He was a guard captain. Yeah. I think he actually produced it later and said he found it on Jeff Miller's. So it was hours later or later that day. So, you know, he didn't like shove it into his jacket.
Okay,
he just waved it around later saying, I found this. But it took him almost 5 years to confess that he made that up. And most people didn't believe him, but some did, you know. I mean, given the partisanship of the era, I mean, people wanted to believe that. They wanted to believe the students were armed. The students were not armed. There were no guns. They wanted to believe there was a sniper. There was no sniper. I mean, it was just this kind of bullshit, which mirrors a lot of what's happening today. Every time there's a protest.
Right.
So
it's
the same playbook.
And it's scary because it's a world
It is scary.
Yeah, snipers and provocateurs and, you know, these things that sort of, when you look back at the 60s and 70s and the violence of the 60s and 70s, you see the different ingredients. And I think that's another thing that is so useful about your book, is like sort of laying out those ingredients. And what I like about it is that it doesn't do this, like, your book doesn't do this sort of lame thing at the end where you sort of wrap it up with a legacy and there you go. And it's sort of like it ends right at the shootings. I thought that was a really sort of like elegant turn to sort of make it just about that. And then there's this incredible epilogue. I don't know, spoilers here, but
don't give it away.
Incredible epilogue with Nixon. And I'm just wondering, sort of like, I don't know, the story that I was given, because I'm a little bit younger than you. The story that I was given when I was growing up about Kent State was that, you know, the 60s were a lot of horrible tensions and everyone was fighting, and then Kent State happened and these kids got killed and everyone sort of felt bad. and were so, it was like a loss of innocence sort of thing, and that. In other words, it was kind of marked as the end of the 60s in some way. That
well, I think it was. Yeah, that's
right.
true.
But then I read like the Michener, and that's why I brought it up, because I'd never read those editorials before, and you realize that there were a whole bunch of people who basically said, "I'm glad they shot those kids, and they should shoot more of them." And that's certainly something that my dad, who's baby boomer generation, that's how he was already in the professional world, working at the phone company when Kent State happened, and he always tells me that there were a bunch of guys at work who were saying that sort of stuff. Was that sort of your experience in terms of remembering Kent State and actually being alive during that era, that there was a lot more sort of vitriol aimed at these kids than we tend to remember?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the local paper was just full of letters. We should have killed them all. We should have, they were all communists. They deserved it. They shouldn't have been there. Even though the university was open, because the governor refused to close it, and half the kids that were shot had books in their hands. They were just walking to class. So, okay, you don't deserve to be at your own university that's open and you have to go to class. I very definitely remember that. There was a lot of screaming after Kent State, but there was also well, not immediate. I mean, the immediate reaction was that college campuses around the country exploded. And there were over 450 colleges that were forced to close. I mean, basically the entire higher education system came grinding to a halt because of protests about Kent State. But because of the way it was positioned, you then went straight into summer. And over the course of the summer, I think a lot of people thought about what was happening a little more. And when they came back to campus in the fall, campus protest had pretty much dissipated. It was pretty much spent. I think kids at that point, Nixon was drawing down the war a little bit. I mean, he had announced that they were pulling out. There was a draft lottery, so everybody knew exactly what their chances were of getting drafted. And the draft, as I said, the call-ups were ratcheting down. And I think a lot of kids very reasonably thought, okay, I'm against the war, but do I really want to get shot protesting it? And the protests really died down a lot. Now, there were still big marches on Washington, at least through 71 into 72, but it was definitely something had changed. I mean, Kent State was really the bloody climax of that era, that Vietnam era. That was it. And so there's some truth to that.
Yeah, it feels that way, and it's weird because at the end of your book is that that sort of sitting in that tragedy, but that at the same time feeling like that it's not isolated back in that era, that the things you describe, the sort of
it's very relevant. It's very relevant, chilling relevancy.
Was that part of why you wanted to tell this story right now?
It was, absolutely. And this was, I started this book 4 years ago. So just as Trump was taking power, I decided to go ahead with it. And, as I was doing it, it just kept becoming a little more relevant. And then it was supposed to be out in the spring. It was delayed until the fall because of, why. And, just sitting there over the course of the summer, suddenly the BLM protests explode everywhere, and you've got these horrible. I mean, my book's sitting in a warehouse, and all of this stuff is happening, and it's all going to blow up. And it was torture. Yeah, it was absolute torture. But yeah, I feel like we've circled completely back around to 1970, which is one of the worst years we've ever had, as you know, and learned nothing along the way, and we're right back there. And I certainly hope we don't repeat it, but who knows?
And I wonder, thinking about sort of you growing up, because I think that one of the understudied but more I think compelling elements of the 1970s is the sort of 1970s high school experience. I think of like Dazed and Confused. I think of like you as a part of this generation that sort of like almost in some weird way, maybe benefited is the wrong word. The counterculture had already like kind of, you're like the first high school generation to sort of like be have a bunch. All the boys have long hair. Everyone's smoking pot. At least that's the movie version of 1970s high school.
No, that's fairly accurate. Yeah, that's fairly accurate.
Right.
I mean, we still got busted, but those things were definitely happening. Well, remember all the teachers, and in fact, at my high school, at Dahmer High,
right,
there were a couple guys who were at Kent State in 1970. They were students there.
That's amazing. What a connection.
So the generation gap between the youngest teachers and the students by the late 70s and early 80s, it didn't exist. I mean, they were basically, fellow travelers. Those guys were all smoking pot too.
That's amazing.
So that's the first time that happened. So now I think it's fairly normal, but that's when that was the tipping point when that 60s generation then went into the adult world or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And became teachers. And, they were 24, 25 years old. Some were even younger. And so, yeah, there was a weird kind of relationship there between faculty and students.
I wonder, because you have this counterculture in the 60s,
Right.
and it's so connected. I mean, I'm looking up, I have a poster on my wall, the Yippie flag, right? Abby Hoffman thing, the Youth International Party Manifesto, and
Right.
how directly the counterculture, smoking pot, rock and roll was connected to politics, to sort of left-wing politics. And I feel like, and this is just a thesis, and I don't know if this is true, that the kids in the 1970s that we're talking about here, these high school kids, the politics is kind of not so much a part of it. It's more about the smoking pot and the rock and roll. Is that right? Or am I wrong?
I don't know that that's entirely true. I mean, the draft was a huge fear.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, that was the.
I mean, like in the later 70s. I mean, when you're at Dahmer.
Oh yeah,
High.
later generation. Yeah, nobody cared anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, nobody cared. The politics had completely changed by 75. I mean, once Nixon was out,
right,
then everything changed. And it's amazing how fast it changed. Because in 1970, I mean, you had this war going on. You had these, the street battles. You had just things blowing up everywhere. I mean, it literally seemed like the country was in flames. And then 5 years later, it was over. It was bizarre. But from my perspective, as a kid in 1970, again, I was 10 years old. Yeah, there was a war, but there'd always been a war. I don't remember a time when there wasn't a war. I don't remember a time when streets weren't in flames. So from my perspective, these things were normal. I think for an adult or even an older, like a college kid, it was much more traumatic because they remember what it was like before. I didn't. So it was kind of that bizarre disconnect.
That's really a frightening way of putting it.
Well, no. I mean, we are formed by our experience,
Yeah.
Even though I was growing up in this small town, all this stuff's, it was the classic, the war spills into your living room. And I was already reading the paper pretty closely and taking all this stuff in and processing it in my own way. So
I'm just thinking about young people today growing up thinking, wow, I don't remember a time before war, and I don't remember a time when there weren't, riots or violence on the streets or something like that.
Right.
It's just because I was 22 when 9/11 happened, so I remember this whole period of time. I went to college in the 90s, and and my experience was kind of this end of history Clinton globalization party that. Seinfeld was the most exciting thing going on to me.
Right.
And then 9/11 came, and I kind of became aware all of a sudden of this whole geopolitical nightmare. And of course, then you discover Kent State, and that sort of we've been here down this road before.
We've been here before. Yeah. I know.
So I can't not ask you about my friend Dahmer, because it's a book that. Again, someone gave to me because they knew of my sort of affinity for affinity is the wrong word, serial killers, and Dahmer in particular. And I think that the book again. It's what made me aware of your work, and I think the strength of it. Again, I'm going to compliment you. I'm sorry, but I think the strength of it is it's a high school story, and it tells as much as it's about sort of your encounters and social sort of relationship with this guy who became one of the most notorious serial killers. In American history, it's also really a story about the relationships you have with guys in high school, and it resonated with me a lot. I wondered when that news sort of came out. Was that 92 when the story?
91.
91. I was young, but we were all sort of introduced to the story all at once. In other words, like the person. And do you remember the like exact moment? That must have been like a shocking moment for you to realize you knew this person in high school, and not only knew them, but had a very like kind of interesting, unique relationship with.
Yeah, you think? Yeah, it was a weird day. No, I remember it very well. My wife called me at home. She was a reporter at a newspaper, and the news came over the wire, and she recognized the hometown because they had his hometown, and I think they might have had something else, like where he graduated or something like that. And she called me up and said, I think this guy is this guy you knew in high school. And I won't give away that's also an epilogue of that book, but
right.
Yeah, it's gosh, I'm trying to think back to My Friend Dahmer now. That was 3 books ago, so I'm having trouble jump starting my brain here. The basic, the basic thesis of that book is it's about something universal, which is that oddball kid that is in every school.
Yep.
The one who falls between the cracks, the one who just gets shoved ahead and then pushed out the door. And gee, what happens to that guy? I mean, we all have that kid, and you get together with your friends years later, or you go to a class reunion. Whatever happened to so-and-so? He's probably a serial killer by now.
Right.
Well, guess what? Mine was.
Yeah.
And so that's the universal there. And when you tell these books, you always look for that universal. You want something that people can relate to, because that really affects the reader. That's what does it. And we all went to college in Kent State. And like Kent State. I mean, we all had those same experiences. Coming of age and finding your way and trying to find your place in the world. And then suddenly these kids that we can relate to are cut down. With Dahmer, it was, not too many people go to school with Jeffrey Dahmer, but people can.
Right.
There's lots of potential Dahmers out there.
For sure.
I mean, think about how many school shooters there are,
Yeah. Well, that's part of what I was, reading My Friend Dahmer. I was thinking about, sort of who are the guys. It's usually guys. Who are the guys I went to high school with that I would say, oh, of course, if I heard this about. And there were like a few popped into my head. Right. But Dahmer's such a unique figure, and it seems like at the same time you're sort of like there are other elements at play. It's kind of like Kent State, right? It's sort of like there are many things that need to come together to create this unique moment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's the most extreme example in both cases that you can possibly dream up. It's like the perfect storm, all of these elements come together, and then you have this monumental tragedy. So that's unique, but the elements are what you have to focus on as a storyteller to try to pull in the reader. I mean, that's what I always do.
Yeah, I think that's again the strength of your work, and with the My Friend Dahmer, it was a lot of I don't know. It's a tricky balance. I wonder. I know it was a while ago when you made it, but it's a tricky balance. It seems like when you're very much humanizing this figure, and I felt especially because it was sort of Dahmer before he was a killer, and it was I felt a lot for him, and felt like I was connected to him even in some ways. I think that there's right. I mean, was that something you thought about? Because it's in the movie too. I mean, the movie's fantastic, and I feel like the Dahmer characters.
The movie maybe even more so. They really dance on the knife edge of making him too sympathetic. I mean,
right.
Filmmaker and I had a lot of discussions about that, because you don't want to go there. I mean, you always have to remember that this guy slaughtered, a lot of people.
Yeah.
Brutally.
Yeah.
So my book, it starts out when he's 12 years old. So obviously, it's about the making of a monster. And that's what it is. But as the story progresses, his humanity falls off him in chunks.
Right.
I mean, you just see it. It gets darker and darker and darker, and they take you right to the edge of that first murder, and that's when he becomes a monster. And I think that there are certainly some people who sympathize with my story more than they should. They kind of miss some key points there.
Yeah.
A lot of serial killer fans out there. There are a lot of
Yes.
Jeffrey Dahmer fans out there.
Isn't that insane?
It is insane.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are young women for some reason. I do not get this subsect, but I think most people understand what I'm trying to do. I think obviously at this point, I think they, the reaction of the book was very positive. So I think I pulled it off, but that was always my objective, was to, because when you make somebody a monster right from the beginning and say they were born a monster, well, that absolves everybody.
Right.
He was born a monster. It was inevitable. Well, I don't think it was inevitable. And the story about my friend Dahmer is one of across-the-board failure. In a way, that's a story of Kent State, too. Everybody fails. Everybody, specifically everybody in authority, fails miserably. And they just keep, pushing this guy along, and it results in tragedy. And the same thing happens in Kent State. Everybody fails miserably, and the result is tragedy. So yeah, I haven't really thought about that, but yeah, there's a similarity there.
I'm glad you located that through line, because it makes sense to me too, and it seems like all of your work is sort of, again, I think about
failure.
Yeah, well, it's the 70s, right? And it's like,
well, not all of it. I mean, my first book was actually set in the 80s, early 80s, and then the book about garbage men was actually set the present day. But yeah, my two most well-known books were set in the 70s. Yeah. Though on the opposite ends of the 70s.
That's right. Yeah. It feels like, and watching the film My Friend Dahmer, which sort of plays with a lot of those period details. It's
right.
It's the 70s, and it's the
on an amazingly small budget too. I mean, it was really a miracle they were able to pull that off. But
I think I heard you say in an interview that you considered it one of the better comic book movies, and
yeah, it was very true to form. I mean, it was. They actually filmed it in my hometown. The sets were, in fact, a lot of the real places.
Wow.
Like, that's actually Jeffrey Dahmer's boyhood home that they used.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. Which, I mean, connecting all this together, because, I live in Ohio, so everything's like connected.
Yeah.
The guy who lives in Dahmer's house, and he's a friend of mine who rented it out to the film crew. He's Chris Butler, who's Jeff Miller's friend at Kent State.
Whoa. Yeah. I was like, Chris Butler. I just read that name somewhere. Yeah.
So it's like all these weird threads that go together. I've told Butler, it's like, you're in all my books, man.
Well, I'm not from Ohio, and I haven't spent much time in Ohio at all. And yet I feel like I have, because I've spent time reading your books.
That's very flattering. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like you've created a sort of regional history. I wonder if that was ever your goal, was to sort of tell.
No, I mean, you write about what you know.
Yeah.
And there are interesting stories all around. All you got to do is find them. I mean, people ask me that all the time, but it's like, hey, man, if you live in, Boise, Idaho, I guarantee you there's interesting stories there. You just have to find them and tell them in an interesting way.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's what I do. But when you write about what you know, and even if it's, in the case of Kent State, I mean, I didn't know it, but I mean, I know the area, I know the vibe, I know a lot of stuff that is unique to this story and to this setting. It gives your work an element of truth.
Yeah.
And that I think the reader can pick up on, even if they're not from here, even if they don't know this truth, they can pick up on it. It's like, oh yeah. I mean, the amount of detail in here is enough that this guy must know what he's talking about,
right?
At least on that level. And I think that resonates with readers. That's been my experience.
Yeah, I wondered in terms of those deciding on projects and figuring out what story are you going to tell next. What was, because had you already done when the Dahmer story broke in 1991? Were you already a comic artist? Were you already sort of working in that? And what was the process of figuring out that you could actually tell that story in this medium?
That was a long process. Yeah. I was doing comic strip at that time that was in weekly papers, those free weekly papers that you used to trip over piles of them whenever you went into coffee shops.
I miss them.
Yeah, so do I. They were great in the 90s and then not so great.
Yeah.
So I was doing that. I was doing gag cartoons, stuff like I was doing whatever I could, and I was fairly successful at it. I was not doing long form storytelling at that time, long form narratives. And it took a long time to ramp up to that. It took me about 18 years to finish my Friend Dahmer.
Wow.
And it had a couple different versions. I mean, obviously I had some stuff to work out on my own,
Right.
some emotional stuff, some mental stuff. There was a lot of baggage there. And
like, you mean like Dahmer specific baggage?
Well, I mean, like psychological stuff,
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, I used to give this guy rides home from school, for Christ's sake.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it was, it took a long time to come to terms with it. And then it took a long time to acquire the skills that I needed to tell long form narrative, because comic strips are very different than, graphic novels. You go from 4-panel comic strip to a 280-page graphic novel. It's not something you're going to do with a snap of a finger.
Right.
So yeah, it took a long time, but you figure things out.
It's a nuanced story, and it's one that sort of, for me, the strength of it, and I think they sort of clarify this turn a little more in the film, because it's just film and they have to do it, to make to wrap up a story. But it feels like it describes a kind of relationship you have with this oddball that other kids have, and the oddball guy that sort of performs oddness for the other kids that sort of are prank kids that want to laugh about it, and they portray that sort of dynamic. I think it's a very young male dynamic,
right?
But it feels like you're painting something, a type of relationship that I felt I definitely recognized, but it's a tricky one to pull
off. It is
off.
tricky. The film makes me a little more of an asshole than I really was.
That's kind of what I was getting at. Yeah.
The performances are very good, and Alex Wolff plays me, and he did a really super. He got across that kind of subversive smartass thing I had going when I was in high school. But the book, I think, is more nuanced, which is not surprising. The book also has narration, which the film does not, and that kind of strips away a whole layer of the story, because then you've got my adult voice, which is laced with regret and second guessing and all this stuff.
Right.
But we were not cruel kids. I mean, that's the important thing, and it was certainly not our finest moment. And I've discussed this with my friends, and we're all pretty much agreement there. It's, some of the stuff we did, we look back on it and just kind of wince. But a lot of people put an awful lot of responsibility on a bunch of 16-year-old kids in a small town. I mean, my basic question was, and I say it directly in the book, where were the damn adults?
Yeah.
And I mean,
when you say that, you mean that Jeffrey Dahmer could have been perhaps there could have been an intervention on this guy, and that it was obvious.
There should have been.
That he was. I mean, if you read the book and the movie, I mean, it's really fucked up, because it like, to me, it's a part of about like mental illness in our culture or something.
Right. Very much so.
Right, because it just feels like this. I can remember, you're talking about like the high school kids I went to school with. They pop into my mind. I won't say their names. I don't know where they are, but they were not okay. Right. and it feels like there are more kids today that are not okay than ever before. Right. It's a particularly cruel part of the story. It feels like
very definitely cruelties. I mean, it's a teenage, not so much cruelty. Well, the cruelty of indifference.
That's what I mean.
It's just kind of that teenage society where teenagers are really only, they're thinking about themselves. They're thinking about their futures. They're thinking about their lives. I mean, this is perfectly understandable, because these are not fully formed brains.
Right.
And having had teenagers myself, I mean, I know that from firsthand experience. And it's ridiculous to expect a teenager to be a fully formed adult. That's not how it works, And I mean, fully formed adults aren't a whole lot better. I mean, who are we kidding here? I mean, we've certainly seen that play out over the last
right.
years. And So a lot of people are looking are looking for blame, but I really place. I mean, I certainly don't diminish my own role in that story, and I don't. I mean, I spent a lot of time on it, and I think pretty unflattering portrait. I mean, it's all there on the page.
But at the same
Brutal
time,
honesty.
you're right. I mean, what responsibility is it of the high school kids to
Right.
to mitigate this this kind of horror that's brewing there? And it's also
Well, when you've got a kid who drinks a fifth of liquor before class every morning,
Yeah.
and none of the adults give a shit, where does the blame lie? I mean,
right,
on me? I don't
Yeah.
think so.
right,
Because I didn't turn him in. Well, name a teenager who's going to turn in a buddy. I wish I had. I wish I'd just tipped somebody off, but I don't think there are too many kids that would do that, especially in the '70s, where the worst thing you could be was a narc. That was absolutely drilled into our brains. That's that dazed and
right.
confused thing. I mean, it was absolutely drilled into us. So, yeah, it's a whole.
It's weird. I don't know what you think of this, but it's come up on the show before in part because the historian Rick Perlstein, we had him on recently, and he talked. His latest book is about the late '70s, the Carter years, which is where basically my friend Dahmer takes place basically in the Carter years, but just the idea that the '70s were this this dive into darkness. There were the beginnings of the Zodiac killer, and the sort of like 3 Mile Island, and Jonestown, I think, was in 1978 as well.
Love Canal.
Right. I mean,
Love Canal.
did you feel that? The only reason I bring it up is because I think of Dahmer, and I think of like as connected. I think of this Midwest serial killer thing, and it's sort of like very easy to make big conclusions about this sort of stuff. I think that's what's useful about My Friend Dahmer is it gets you into sort of like, I don't know, just like the Kent State book you've done, you get more detail and you get more context and you understand the story from that perspective.
Every every decade or generation has its own dark parts. Name one that doesn't.
That's right. Yeah.
There's never been this blissful, peaceful time that the reactionaries pined for. Name it. What exactly are you talking about here? The 50s,
That's
the
way
40s,
we call this show Nostalgia
30s?
Trap, Derf, because
Right,
it's
exactly.
a trap. Yeah.
So I don't think I bought into that even when it was happening. It's like every generation faces its challenges and has its catastrophes and tragedies. It's just the way it is. I mean, we were all living on the edge of the button too. I mean, that's
right.
that's something that because the Cold War was still in full force, and it was I mean, none of us really knew if we were going to live to see the next I mean, I didn't spend a lot of time dwelling on it, but it was always there. Berlin Wall was up, the Soviet Union seemed invincible. It was a stressful time. Every time's a stressful time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just uniquely stressful.
Right.
2020 has its own unique stresses that hopefully will never repeat, but guess what, we'll have different stresses.
Yeah.
The kids of 1970 probably feel the same way.
Well, I just want to thank you for what you're doing, because we talk about history a lot on this show. We talk about this period of history, the 60s and 70s, a lot, and it feels like I honestly consider you one of the finest historians working today of this era, because we think a lot about the form of history, not just the content of history, right? And that's why I brought up history films, and I'm often very dismissive of them, but I think you're right. I think they are getting better. I think people are aware of the sort of cliche issue of depicting history, but I
you don't want to wallow in nostalgia. That's the important thing,
right.
I mean, you have to show it very, very frankly with all the warts.
Right, but I think it's an aesthetic thing, though, too, right? Like, to me, like, it's an aesthetic thing as well. I feel like your books. I mean, we talked about the text a lot, but the artwork is fantastic, and I feel like there's a sort of kinetic energy to the way you've created this stuff. It feels like I'm watching a movie while I'm reading it. It's paced in a way that sort of draws your eye. In really important ways, and it makes me think about sort of the aesthetic presentation of history. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, it's a very suspenseful book, surprisingly, since we know how it's going to end.
Yeah, it is.
Still, I mean, it just really kind of just careens along. I wanted to give this kind of the experience of this out of control train just, heading straight for a cliff. I mean,
Yeah.
that's because that's what it was. And that's how the students of 1970 described it to me. They just got swept up in this and swept along. And then, suddenly there are bodies everywhere.
It feels like even the National Guardsmen and law enforcement and even
sure,
the people in the
sure.
town, they all seem swept up in the same sort of and it's hard not to see that connected to 2020. I know we go through, we repeat over and over, but it has its own special flavor. And in 2020, it feels like everyone's geared into their own story, and that story can be connected to all sorts of really ugly sort of psychological things brewing in the culture.
Right. 1970 is not that well known. I mean, everybody knows about 68.
Right.
But 1970, people just kind of forget about it, and it was every bit as bad. I mean, in many ways worse. So you had, it ended with Altamont.
Right.
And the weathermen and the Days of Rage and all that stuff, and then it segued right into 1970. And 1970 was a very, very bad year. And you had all this stuff happening all around, and a lot of it's not really that well known. Like the Weathermen, for example, most people have forgotten about them. It's a great story.
Right.
I mean, I actually kind of went down the rabbit hole with them. I just kept reading and reading and reading because it was so fascinating and really has not been documented, as most radical left groups are not, because they were so secretive and they were so, fractionalized. If that's a word. Is that a word?
Yeah. We'll let it slide. Is it yeah, how much do you want to recreate that radical left of the 70s? Because it seems like that's work that it's something we talk about a lot on this show. I did my work on the GI coffee houses, which were opened by SDS people and socialists and communists and stuff like that in the late 60s and early 70s. But that radical world, it feels like, is something that you could do more work on. Do you know what your next project is? Do you know what you're going to do next?
No, I have not decided. 2020 has really kind of steamrolled me. So, because I just lost my mom to COVID.
Oh my God, I'm sorry. That's insane.
So it's been pretty hard to be creative. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm just kind of focused on promoting this book right now as best I can online because, I had a 40-stop book tour go up in smoke too. So it's just like one thing on top of another, It's like, what else can suck this year? Oh, here we go. Thanks. It's been hard to be creative. I'm starting to kick some stuff around, but I really don't know. I may need a break. I may need to do a comedy because this book took a lot out of me. I did a comedy after My Friend Dahmer, and that was really a nice palate cleanser. So I don't know. More books, more stories. I'll think of something.
Yeah, I noticed in your book you talked about your research and you spent time at Kent State University. It seems like that was one of the main places where you were, and it seems like that itself would be an exhausting experience.
Yes and no. I mean, it's a great little town. It's a great campus, but it does have a palpable sadness about it. I mean, it's different than other colleges. And the shooting site, I mean, the campus is a National Historic Site now, so it's preserved, and you can actually walk. I mean, you can walk right down, and there's the markers where the fort fell. It's a very moving experience to be there. And walking around looking for settings in the book and recreating, like finding Jeff's house and finding Bill's house, and trying to recreate that. I mean, these are. Yeah, you get caught up in the story. It becomes very emotional.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Derf. I really
Thanks for having me.
Cannot recommend your work enough, and I think that there are many strengths of Kent State, For Dead in Ohio, which I recommend everyone go get and look at these look at these images in their full size, because it captures something that I've never really seen in the Kent State story before. Not just the sort of historical context, but the really human story of these four kids, and that's the sort of the heart of it. And I found myself incredibly moved by the story. So it's an act of history, and it's a really, really powerful one. So thanks for joining us, and congratulations on all the stuff you're putting together. I think your stuff is wonderful, Derf.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Okay, huge thank you to Derf Backderf. Had a really fun time talking with him. Go get Kent State, 4 Dead in Ohio. Go get My Friend Dahmer, Trashed. He's got a number of other wonderful books. We didn't get to talk about all of them, but really, really fun stuff, and I think really important stuff as I gushed to Derf in this episode. I really appreciate the work he is doing. So thanks, Derf, and thanks to all of you who are supporting the show. If you want to become part of our little network, we're having a lot of fun. We're doing live shows, etc., and talking a lot about movies and pop culture as we try to unpack what has happened in our lives. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And again, I can't thank the people who are supporting the show enough. It makes all of this really fun and really satisfying for all of our contributors. And we'll talk to you again very soon. Okay, take care. See ya.